9 bullets to the face and chest. A clinical targeted execution on a freezing Harlem street. Yet the victim wasn't a gang enforcer. He was a lyrical genius, mere days away from signing a multi-million-dollar empire. His name was Lamont Coleman. Why did a poet become the primary target of a street assassination? And how does the cold-blooded street execution of Harlem legend Big L remain unsolved after 27 years? The true magnitude of this execution is anchored deeply in Lamont Coleman's physical reality. Born in 1974, he came of age during the most volatile decades in New York's history. Harlem in the late 1980s and 1990s was a landscape defined by extreme economic deprivation, the aggressive, unchecked expansion of the narcotics trade, and fierce territorial warfare. Specifically, the area around 139th Street and Lenox Avenue was a harsh demographic reality, grimly christened by its residents as the danger zone. It was a closed ecosystem where daily survival depended heavily on acute situational awareness, strategic alliances, and a constant, exhausting vigilance. Yet, Lamont was not a foot soldier in this territorial war. He operated entirely as its war correspondent. While his peers were becoming entangled in the violent mechanics of street survival, Lamont was obsessively studying the architecture of language. His psychological weakness, his fatal hamartia, was not an appetite for crime, but a profound, almost naive loyalty to his postcode. He possessed a rare, innate ability to construct intricate rhyme schemes that left critics and seasoned industry veterans astounded. He painted visceral, unsparing portraits of the violence surrounding him, yet he actively refused to participate in the bloodshed. He used his intellect to document the danger zone, maintaining a delicate, almost impossible, neutrality on corners, where neutrality was often viewed as a weakness. The public perceived him as a hardened, untouchable architect of street narratives. But his internal reality was entirely different. He was a meticulous technician of syllables, a man who viewed his neighborhood as a muse rather than a battlefield. He believed that his talent, combined with his quiet, everyday demeanor, made him immune to the crossfire. But staying entirely neutral in a combat zone is a luxury the streets rarely, if ever, afford. Lamont lived his life parallel to the violence, geographically trapped in the same few square miles as the notorious 139th Street NFL crew. He remained entirely detached from their illicit logistics, yet he shared a bloodline with the underworld. His older brother, Leroy Finazzi, widely known throughout Harlem as Big Lee, was deeply entrenched in the local power dynamics. Big Lee was reputed to be a formidable entity, a man whose executive decisions in the illicit economy generated fierce, unforgiving rivals. For years, the formidable reputation of his older brother provided a protective canopy over Lamont. The streets understood that touching the quiet younger brother would invite catastrophic retaliation from Big Lee. Up to this point, everything is still functional. Lamont observed, he wrote, he recorded his music, and he built his career, safely anchored to the very pavement that raised him. He was standing on the absolute precipice of generational wealth, actively setting up his own independent label, Flamboyant Entertainment. The exit door from the danger zone was slowly swinging open, offering him a permanent escape from the sirens and the yellow police tape. But he stubbornly maintained his old habits. He continued to sleep in his mother's apartment at 45 West 139th Street, He walked the same blocks, interacted with the same crowds, and refused to hire the private security that his impending corporate status demanded. And that very habit will come back to ruin him later. He failed to recognize that the protective shield of his family name was entirely conditional. When the structures of power in the underworld shift, and when primary targets become unreachable, the unwritten rules of proxy retaliation take over. The streets do not recognize the immunity of a poet. They only recognize proximity and leverage. By refusing to physically remove himself from the danger zone, Lamont Coleman inadvertently transformed himself from an untouchable observer into the most valuable collateral damage in Harlem. Long before the execution, the physical and psychological architecture of Harlem in the 1980s forged this prodigy inside a literal war zone. Lamont Coleman was a child of the crack cocaine epidemic, an era that fundamentally aggressively redesigned the socio-economic landscape of urban America. The crack cocaine epidemic forced a rapid, catastrophic structural collapse across urban America. The introduction of cheap, highly addictive narcotics transformed ordinary neighborhoods into highly militarized zones of commerce and violence. The area surrounding 139th Street and Lenox Avenue, where Lamont spent his formative years, became a focal point of this crisis. The most compelling contradiction in the life of Lamont Coleman is the massive chasm between his everyday personality and the persona he would eventually project to the world. Those who knew him during his adolescence consistently describe a quiet, deeply observant, and remarkably unassuming young man. Unlike the physically imposing enforcers surrounding him, Lamont was an introvert navigating the loudest, most dangerous environment in the country. Yet, inside his notebooks, he was constructing a persona of unparalleled ferocity. This is where we see the physical manifestation of his psychological state. While other young men on his block were stockpiling firearms and accumulating illicit wealth, Lamont was stockpiling vocabulary. He was known to spend hours meticulously studying the dictionary, actively hunting for obscure words, complex phonetic structures, and unconventional syllables that his peers were completely ignoring. He realized early on that while he could not physically dominate the drug dealers on his corner, he could intellectually decimate them on a microphone. His notebook became his armor, and his vocabulary became his ammunition. He observed the bleak, violent reality of the danger zone and processed it through an astonishingly sophisticated linguistic filter. His genius lay not just in rhythm, but in the rigorous structural engineering of his lyrics. This is not about the superficial glamour of the entertainment industry. This is about the rigorous, almost obsessive application of intellect. In the early 1990s, the standard for rap lyricism was relatively straightforward, relying heavily on simple end rhymes and basic narrative structures. Lamont completely dismantled this framework. He pioneered and perfected the use of the multisyllabic rhyme, or multis. He engineered complex sentences where 3, 4, or even 5 syllables in a single line perfectly mirrored the phonetic structure of the next line, all while maintaining a coherent, brutally vivid narrative. Furthermore, he possessed a razor-sharp comedic timing, delivering punchlines with the clinical precision of a seasoned stand-up comedian. He would paint a picture of utter urban despair, only to violently flip the perspective with a metaphor so unexpected and intelligent that it demanded immediate rewinding. He was not just recounting the violence of Harlem. He was weaponizing the English language to elevate the grim reality of his postcode into high art. He was an architect of syntax, operating in a neighborhood where most institutions had long since collapsed. The sheer cognitive processing power required to freestyle, to invent these complex multisyllabic structures instantaneously off the top of his head, was nothing short of prodigious. He would stand in the local parks or on the street corners, surrounded by hardened criminals, and command absolute, undivided respect simply through the projection of his intellect. However, this extraordinary talent birthed a profound psychological delusion, establishing the fatal weakness that would ultimately dictate his destiny. Lamont began to conflate lyrical supremacy with physical immunity. Because he could silence a crowd of armed gang members with a 2-minute vocal performance, he subconsciously developed the belief that his artistic value exempted him from the brutal laws of the street. This cognitive dissonance sits at the very core of his tragedy. He was writing hyperviolent, incredibly detailed accounts of street executions and gang warfare. Yet he fundamentally believed that because he was the narrator, he could never be reduced to a mere character in the story. He viewed himself as a journalist embedded in a war zone, holding a press pass that made him untouchable. But the streets do not recognize journalistic neutrality, nor do they care about the complexity of a rhyme scheme. The physical reality of the danger zone was entirely indifferent to his intellectual brilliance. A bullet does not distinguish between a crime boss and a poet. He operated under the unwavering conviction that his intellect provided a physical force field against the very violence he was documenting. He built a reputation based on physical intimidation, strategic alliances, and the absolute willingness to exercise violence when necessary. Big Lee became a highly visible, highly influential figure in the local underworld. This created a highly volatile dynamic for Lamont. On one hand, Big Lee's formidable reputation provided a temporary, terrifying shield for his younger brother. The local predators understood that extorting or harming Lamont would invite immediate, catastrophic retaliation from Big Lee. But on the other hand, this association tethered Lamont directly to the highest levels of underworld conflict. He was no longer just an innocent bystander. He was the blood relative of a major player. He was living under a borrowed umbrella of protection, completely unaware of how quickly the weather could turn. As Lamont transitioned from a local phenomenon into a legitimate recording artist, his voice began to echo far beyond the confines of 139th Street. He formed a formidable collective known as Children of the Corn, aligning himself with other rising Harlem talents like Cameron, Murda Mace, and Bloodshed. They dominated the underground circuit, passing rudimentary cassette tapes hand to hand, building a mythos that eventually forced the major corporate record labels to pay attention. Lamont was signing his first recording contracts, traveling outside of his borough, and tasting the initial fruits of his obsessive labor. He was proving that his intellect could genuinely serve as an exit visa from poverty. Yet despite the influx of capital and the rising national profile, he remained physically anchored to the danger zone. He would finish a studio session in Midtown Manhattan, surrounded by industry executives and expensive equipment, only to take the train straight back to the volatile intersection of 139th and Lenox. Up to this point, His dual existence was still functioning. He was balancing the boardroom and the block with apparent ease. But the intricate web of street politics surrounding his brother was beginning to tighten. Driven by an uncompromising attachment to his roots, this stubborn refusal to abandon the dangerous pavement that birthed him was silently transforming him into a high-value target in a war he had no intention of fighting. 139th Street operated not merely as a passive backdrop, but as an active antagonist that shaped, restricted, and ultimately terminated the life of Lamont Coleman. The inevitability of his murder was built into the very bricks of the danger zone, an isolated ecosystem governed by a ruthless street economy in the late 1990s. The danger zone was a sharply defined physical territory, roughly bordered by Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue. The physical manifestation of this neighborhood was a testament to systemic neglect. It was a grid of aging red brick tenements, narrow alleys that served as fatal choke points, and concrete courtyards bathed in the harsh, artificial glare of high-intensity police floodlights. But the issue is not what the architecture looked like. The issue is how the architecture functioned. The danger zone operated as a sovereign state within New York City. When municipal law enforcement treats a neighborhood as a containment zone, rather than a community requiring protection, the vacuum of authority is immediately filled by those willing to exercise the most extreme forms of violence. The governing body of this specific concrete grid was an infamous local syndicate known as the 139th Street Crew, or the NFL Crew. The NFL Crew functioned as a highly structured corporate-style criminal enterprise. By the late 1990s, the chaotic turf wars of the 1980s crack epidemic had evolved, directly dictating how power was exercised and ultimately answering why a poet was executed. The 139th Street Crew managed local narcotics distribution, but more crucially, they controlled the absolute currency of the streets, fear and reputation. In the corporate world of Manhattan, just a 20-minute subway ride away, power is exercised through legal contracts, non-disclosure agreements, and financial litigation. In the danger zone, power is maintained through the absolute, undeniable guarantee of disproportionate physical retaliation. If a rival faction infringed on their territory, or if a local resident violated the code of silence, the syndicate did not simply issue a warning. They dismantled the offender physically, often in broad daylight, to send a visceral broadcast to the rest of the postcode. The cruelty was not a byproduct. The cruelty was the point. It was a marketing strategy designed to ensure total compliance. Standing on the corner of 139th Street, steeped in an environment where the life expectancy of a young male was statistically comparable to an active military combat zone, one could look south down the avenue and clearly see the glittering spires of the Manhattan skyline. The wealthiest financial capital on the planet was clearly visible from the pavement. Yet for the residents of the danger zone, it might as well have been on another planet. The invisible border between these two worlds was enforced not by walls, but by economics and the suffocating gravity of street culture. In a postcode where young men walked with their shoulders hunched, their eyes constantly darting, scanning the perimeter for undercover officers or approaching rivals, Lamont walked with a devastatingly naive sense of ease. His physical posture on the pavement completely contradicted the paranoid, hyper-violent lyrics he was recording in the studio. He had achieved significant underground success, and he wore the financial rewards of that success visibly. He frequently walked down the 139th Street wearing a massive diamond-encrusted gold chain. To Lamont, that heavy jewelry was a bespoke Medal of Honor. It was a physical testament to his intellect, a proof that he had conquered the music industry using nothing but his vocabulary. He believed the neighborhood looked at that chain with pride, viewing him as a favored son who had beaten the systemic odds. But the reality of the streets is far more cynical. An ecosystem built on extreme deprivation does not possess the capacity for communal pride. It only possesses an insatiable hunger. In the eyes of the predatory factions surrounding him, Lamont was not a favored son. He was a high-value, highly visible, and completely unprotected target, walking through a designated kill zone. The profound delusion of diplomatic immunity clouded his judgment. He genuinely believed that his artistic brilliance granted him a free pass to navigate the danger zone without consequence. He thought that because he was articulating the pain of the streets to a global audience, the streets would grant him safe passage in return. He failed to understand that the pavement has no memory, no gratitude, and absolutely no respect for poetry. Lamont was oblivious to these arithmetic calculations. He continued to sit on the stoop of his mother's apartment building, chatting with locals, refining his rhymes in his head, completely disconnected from the shifting power dynamics beneath his feet. He did not realize that the formidable reputation of his older brother, Big Lee, was beginning to curdle into a massive liability. Big Lee's aggressive maneuvers in the illicit economy had generated a backlog of severe grievances with highly capable rivals. The protective canopy that had shielded Lamont during his adolescence was rapidly deteriorating, eaten away by the corrosive acid of underworld vendettas. The unwritten laws of the danger zone soon became legally binding on a man who never signed the contract. Lamont was negotiating multi-million-dollar recording deals in polished corporate boardrooms during the day, completely unaware that his brother's street ledgers were being audited in blood during the night. He was attempting to straddle two entirely incompatible universes. He wanted the financial and cultural supremacy of the global entertainment industry, but he psychologically refused to relinquish the dangerous, authentic grit of his Harlem postcode. He wanted to be the voice of 139th Street without acknowledging that 139th Street frequently devours its own voices. In the sovereign alternative economy of the Harlem underworld, individualism is an illusion. Citizens are inherently tethered to the sins, the debts, and the conflicts of their family tree. The motive behind Lamont Coleman's brutal execution was entirely rooted in the architecture of his bloodline, specifically his older half-brother, Leroy Finney, universally known on the pavement as Big Lee. The issue here is not simply that Lamont had a sibling involved in illicit activities. The ISUE is the sheer magnitude of how Big Lee exercised his power, and how that specific brand of power created a fatal, inescapable vacuum the moment it was removed from the board. The physical and psychological contrast between the two brothers was stark. Lamont was a meticulous technician of language, a quiet, observant introvert who carried notebooks and spent his isolation decoding the English dictionary. Big Lee, however, utilized an entirely different instrument of survival. He was a highly visible, physically imposing architect of street economics. In the brutal, hyper-competitive ecosystem of the 1990s Harlem narcotics trade, you did not rise to prominence through diplomacy. Big Lee navigated a world where market share was secured through intimidation, strategic alliances, and the absolute unhesitating willingness to deploy severe physical violence. He was not a low-level corner hustler. He was a recognized, formidable entity. He commanded a distinct level of respect, but in the danger zone, respect is almost always entirely synonymous with fear. Power in this specific environment was governed by an invisible street ledger. Every action Big Lee took to expand his influence, every rival he humiliated, and every territorial dispute he settled by force, generated a permanent entry in this invisible ledger. The underworld does not feature a judicial system to mediate grievances, nor does it recognize the concept of a statute of limitations. A grievance remains active until it is settled in blood. For years, Big Lee's formidable reputation operated as a heavy iron shield over Lamont. Rival factions understood a fundamental mathematical equation. Attempting to extort, rob, or harm the quiet younger brother would invite an immediate, catastrophic, and disproportionate retaliation from Big Lee. The threat of that retaliation was so severe that Lamont was effectively granted diplomatic immunity in a postcode that routinely slaughtered its own youth. Yet, the illusion of safety persisted. Lamont assumed the pavement spared him out of respect for his status, completely blind to the cold reality. He was only breathing freely because the streets feared his brother's wrath. He lived in the epicenter of a gangland war, failing to understand that in the arithmetic calculations of the underworld, blood makes you a co-signer to every single debt your family incurs. He was building his career on the assumption that his brother's shield was permanent. This illusion of permanence shattered entirely when the legal system finally intervened. The pivotal catastrophic turning point in the timeline of Lamont Coleman's life did not occur in a recording booth or on a street corner. It occurred when the state authorities successfully indicted and incarcerated Leroy Finney. Big Lee was removed from the streets and placed behind the thick steel doors of a state penitentiary. This event fundamentally altered the power dynamics of the 139th Street ecosystem. The heavy iron shield that had protected Lamont for his entire adolescence instantly evaporated. He was suddenly standing in the middle of a torrential downpour without an umbrella, completely exposed to a decade's worth of his brother's accumulated enemies. And this is where the psychology of the proxy hit, one of the most grotesque and ruthless tactics in criminal warfare, comes into absolute clarity. When a high-value target like Big Lee is secured behind prison walls, his rivals do not simply forgive his debts and move on. They experience a profound frustration. They possess the leverage, the weaponry, and the desire for retribution, but they cannot physically reach their primary antagonist. Therefore, they pivot. They look for the softest, most valuable asset connected to their enemy. This is not a crime of passion. It is a highly calculated strategic maneuver designed to inflict maximum psychological devastation. By targeting the beloved, talented younger brother, a rival faction achieves ADUL victory. They eliminate a piece of Big Lee's legacy, and they successfully destroy him from the inside out, forcing him to sit powerless in a prison cell while his family is executed on the pavement he used to control. As the physical danger surrounding him reached an absolute unprecedented peak, Lamont's career was simultaneously reaching its commercial zenith. He was officially transitioning from an underground legend to a mainstream commodity. He was stepping into VIP clubs, negotiating with elite corporate executives, and preparing to sign a contract that would alter his family's financial trajectory for generations. His everyday behavior reflected the confidence of a man who believed he had already won the war. He continued to walk the streets of Harlem completely unprotected, a highly visible target navigating a volatile ecosystem. He continued to sleep in his mother's apartment. He continued to navigate the exact same corners, completely blind to the reality that he had been downgraded from a protected local artist to an unprotected high-value proxy target. Imagine the physical manifestation of this scenario. You have a young man carrying a notebook filled with multisyllabic rhymes, walking casually past abandoned tenements where seasoned predators are actively auditing his brother's unpaid debts. It is identical to a civilian joyfully strolling through a live minefield, holding a map of an entirely different country. Lamont was playing by the rules of the American music industry, assuming his talent was his currency. His enemies were playing by the unwritten constitution of the danger zone, where the only recognized currency is leverage and blood. He failed to comprehend that the people watching him from the shadows did not see a lyrical genius on the verge of a platinum record. They simply saw Leroy Finnezy's unprotected younger brother. The tragedy of geographical loyalty is that it blinds you to the shifting mechanics of your own environment. If Lamont had possessed a clinical understanding of street politics, the moment the judge handed down Big Lee's prison sentence, Lamont would have immediately relocated. He would have used his advance money to move his mother and himself out of the 5 boroughs of New York entirely. But his psychological anchor to Harlem was too deep. He romanticized the struggle. He believed that abandoning the block would dilute the authenticity of his music. He chose geographical loyalty over physical survival, an error in judgment that the streets never forgive. Up to this point, the danger was still a theoretical construct. The enemies of Big Lee were circling, calculating the risks, and observing Lamont's daily routines. They were noting his lack of private security, his predictable movements, and his astonishingly naive sense of comfort. Everything was still in the planning phase. But as the bitter winter of early 1999 approached, the theoretical enemies of the Finnezy bloodline found their perfect, physical vulnerability. The abstract concept of proxy retaliation was about to materialize into cold steel and hollow point ammunition. And this is where the dark, calculating mathematics of the street finally stop observing and begin to select a specific date for execution. By the dawn of 1999, Lamont Coleman had essentially won the war. He had navigated the treacherous labyrinth of the music industry, survived the ruthless economics of the danger zone, and was actively building a massive corporate and financial reality. This was not a fading artist desperately clinging to past glory. This was a prodigious intellect entering his absolute prime, both creatively and commercially. In the early months of 1999, Lamont had just returned from a highly successful international tour across Europe. For a young man raised in the suffocating, claustrophobic grid of Harlem, the physical transition was staggering. He was performing in front of thousands of fans in Amsterdam and London, audiences who memorized his complex multisyllabic rhyme schemes despite English not being their primary language. He was experiencing the tangible global impact of his own vocabulary. Concurrently, he was demonstrating an acute executive acumen. Frustrated by the notoriously exploitative contracts of major record labels, he had independently founded Flamboyant Entertainment. He was releasing his own singles, controlling his own publishing, and operating with a level of financial literacy that completely shattered the stereotype of the naive urban artist. And this is where the corporate hegemony of the music industry intersects with the pavement of 139th Street. His independent success had forced the titans of the industry to the negotiating table. Lamont was in advanced, highly confidential discussions with Damon Dash and Jay-Z to sign a joint venture with Rockefeller Records. At that specific moment in history, Rockefeller was not just a label, it was an empire, the most powerful and culturally significant imprint in hip-hop. The executives at Rockefeller did not merely want to sign Big L, they viewed him as a peer, a lyrical heavyweight capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with their marquee roster. The paperwork was actively being drafted. The legal teams were finalizing the terms. A multi-million-dollar infusion of capital, backed by global distribution, was weeks, perhaps merely days, away from execution. This created the most agonizing paradox of his existence. We are looking at a man holding a pen that is about to sign a contract capable of generating generational wealth, yet he is using that same pen to write lyrics on a crumbling concrete stoop where a hit squad is meticulously mapping his daily movements. He had secured the exit visa. He had the financial capacity to rent a luxury penthouse in Midtown Manhattan, to hire a detail of armed private security, to physically sever his ties with the danger zone forever. Yet his everyday personality, anchored by that fata weakness, his uncompromising geographical loyalty, compelled him to return to 45 West 139th Street. The issue is not that he wanted to visit his mother. The issue is that he fundamentally failed to recognize that his childhood home had been legally and physically reclassified by the underworld as hostile territory. He was operating under a terrifying psychological delusion, a cognitive dissonance that plagues many successful individuals who rise from extreme poverty. He believed that his newfound corporate status retroactively altered the unwritten constitution of his neighborhood. He thought the danger zone would look at his impending Rockefeller deal and grant him a diplomatic pardon. He assumed the bloc was proud of him. But an ecosystem built on extreme deprivation, gangland warfare, and untreated trauma does not possess the capacity for pride. It only possesses the capacity for envy, leverage, and predatory calculus. In the immediate build-up to a targeted assassination, power is exercised differently than in corporate warfare. A rival will send a cease and desist letter, a barrage of litigation, or a public relations smear campaign. There are clear, decipherable warning signs. In the sovereign state of the Harlem underworld, power is exercised through absolute, terrifying silence. There were no dramatic confrontations in the days leading up to February 1999. There were no anonymous phone calls threatening his life. No one drove past his mother's apartment, firing warning shots into the air. In the mathematics of a professional street hit, you do not warn your target. A warning gives the target time to arm themselves, time to retaliate, or time to relocate. The absence of a threat is often the most severe threat of all. This silence acted as a lethal narcotic on Lamont's situational awareness. Because the environment around him appeared completely normal, he behaved completely normally. We must focus on the physical manifestations of his vulnerability. He continued his routine with a devastatingly casual demeanor. He walked to the local bodega to buy juice without checking the reflections in the parked car windows. He stood on the corner laughing with childhood friends without scanning the rooftops or the narrow alleyways. He carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a conqueror, completely oblivious to the crosshairs resting squarely on his chest. He was prosecuting his career with absolute brilliance, while completely ignoring the fact that the streets were prosecuting his bloodline. To the seasoned detectives who would later review the timeline, this period of false security is the most chilling aspect of the dossier. A targeted execution is not a crime of passion. It is a complex logistics operation. While Lamont was sitting in label meetings discussing track lists and marketing rollouts, a completely separate shadow operation was taking place parallel to his life. His executioners were studying his habits. They noted the exact time he left his apartment, the routes he walked, and the people he associated with. They were calculating the response time of the local NYPD precinct. They were selecting the optimal caliber of ammunition and the most reliable vehicle for a rapid extraction. The two timelines, the corporate rise of Big L and the tactical deployment of a hit squad, were racing toward a violent, inevitable intersection. His impending strike was not a result of stolen narcotics, court testimonies, or gang insults. He was simply existing as the most valuable, unprotected asset connected to his incarcerated brother, Big Lee. The predators watching him did not hate Lamont Coleman. In the cold, emotionless arithmetic of proxy retaliation, hate is entirely irrelevant. Lamont was simply a line item on a ledger that needed to be balanced. He was a debt that his brother had accrued, and the underworld was preparing to collect the payment in the only currency it accepted. As the first 2 weeks of February 1999 elapsed, attention in the unseen world reached a boiling point. The trap had been meticulously set. The actors were in position. The weather in New York City was brutally cold, forcing most residents indoors, clearing the streets, and inadvertently creating the perfect, sterile environment for a drive-by shooting. Lamont Coleman was standing at the absolute zenith of his potential, looking directly at a limitless future, completely unaware that his timeline had already been truncated by a group of men sitting in an idling vehicle just a few blocks away. A multi-million-dollar contract awaited his signature, completely oblivious to the hit squad already positioned to terminate his timeline. The sun began to set on Monday, February 15th, and the danger zone prepared to execute its final irrevocable judgment. The timeline of Monday, February 15th, 1999, forces us to abandon any lingering cinematic illusions about urban violence. There is no swelling orchestral score, no dramatic monologue, and no slow-motion realization of impending doom. There is only the brutal, unforgiving physics of a targeted street assassination. As evening descended on Harlem, the temperature plummeted, driving most civilians indoors and clearing the pavement. The ambient noise of the danger zone settled into the standard low-frequency hum of a winter night in New York City. Lamont Coleman stepped out onto the familiar concrete of West 139th Street. He was entirely relaxed, completely immersed in the illusion of his own geographical immunity. He possessed no weapon. He wore no ballistic vest. He carried only the physical manifestations of his impending corporate success. At approximately 8:30 p.m., the theoretical danger that had been hovering over his bloodline finally materialized into a kinetic reality. A vehicle navigated onto the block. In the mechanics of a professional hit, the vehicle is just as crucial as the firearm. It serves as an anonymous method of insertion and a rapid, untraceable mechanism for extraction. The vehicle did not screech its tires. It did not announce its arrival. It simply closed the distance between the predator and the proxy target with terrifying efficiency. What occurred next took only a matter of seconds, but the forensic footprint left behind requires a meticulous, almost clinical dissection to fully comprehend. The assailants did not issue a demand. They did not shout a warning or attempt to engage in a performative display of dominance. A vehicle stopped near the block. The silence of the Harlem winter was violently shattered by the concussive roar of close-range gunfire, an ambush executed with terrifying efficiency before the assailants accelerated into the vast, anonymous traffic grid of Manhattan. The specific ballistics of the event serve as a silent prosecuting attorney. The shooter or shooters discharged 9 rounds. But the issue is not simply the number of bullets. The issue is the specific type of ammunition utilized and the geometrical precision of the strike. The forensic reports indicate the use of hollow point ammunition. To a layperson, this might seem like a minor technical detail, but in the realm of criminal homicide, it is a glaring spotlight on the psychological intent of the perpetrators. Hollow point bullets are not designed for target practice, nor are they typically used in spontaneous, emotion-driven street scuffles. A standard full metal jacket bullet is designed to pierce. It often passes cleanly through a target, creating a straight wound channel. A hollow point bullet is specifically engineered to expand, or mushroom, upon impact with human tissue. It is designed to rapidly transfer all of its kinetic energy into the target, creating massive catastrophic internal trauma and ensuring immediate organ failure. The selection of this specific ammunition eliminates any hypothesis of a random drive-by or a warning shot. The perpetrators loaded their magazines with the explicit, premeditated intention of ensuring that even if paramedics arrived within 60 seconds, the victim would be entirely beyond medical salvation. The physical geometry of the gunshot wounds further solidifies this horrifying reality. In a panicked, chaotic shootout, bullet trajectories are wild. They strike extremities, shatter windows, and embed themselves in brick walls. The 9 shots fired at Lamont Coleman were grouped with a chilling clinical accuracy. They were concentrated entirely on the face and the upper torso, the absolute center of mass. The rounds devastated the heart, the lungs, and the cranial cavity. The shooter possessed a steady hand, a clear line of sight, and a terrifying lack of hesitation. This was the phenomenon known in criminal psychology as overkill. The sheer volume and placement of the fire were not necessary to neutralize a threat. They were necessary to send a definitive, undeniable message to the incarcerated Big Lee. The message was written in the absolute destruction of his brother. When the echoing crack of the gunfire finally ceased, the vehicle vanished into the winter night, leaving behind a profound, terrifying silence. Lamont Coleman collapsed onto the freezing tarmac, his blood rapidly pooling on the very pavement he had stubbornly refused to abandon. Within minutes, the flashing lights of the New York Police Department bathed the intersection in a harsh blue and red glare. First responders secured the perimeter, unspooling yellow crime scene tape across 139th Street. As seasoned homicide detectives stepped over the tape, they immediately began to process the scene, searching for the narrative of the crime. And it was here, under the blinding floodlights, that they encountered the most baffling forensic anomaly of the night. The physical evidence, or rather the profound lack thereof, told a story that deeply unsettled the investigators. They looked at the lifeless body of a young man who had just absorbed a devastating barrage of gunfire, yet resting perfectly. Eye intact against his blood-soaked clothing was his heavy diamond-encrusted gold chain. The detectives checked his pockets. His wallet, containing cash and personal identification, was completely undisturbed. In an ecosystem heavily driven by extreme poverty and the frantic economics of the narcotics trade, a murder victim, draped in heavy gold, is an anomaly that demands immediate interpretation. If this had been a robbery, the chain would have been violently snatched from his neck, leaving abrasions and broken links. If this had been a dispute over money, the pockets would have been turned inside out. The pristine condition of Lamont's valuables operated as a silent, unassailable witness. It legally and logically ruled out a mugging. The killers did not want his wealth. They did not want a confrontation. They exclusively wanted his life. The most heartbreaking piece of forensic psychology, however, was found on the victim's hands. Human beings possess a deeply ingrained, uncontrollable survival instinct. When a physical threat suddenly appears, a falling object, a swinging fist, or the raised barrel of a gun, the central nervous system automatically forces the hands and forearms up to protect the face. In forensic pathology, these are classified as defensive wounds. A victim fighting for their life will have gunshot residue on their palms, bullets lodged in their forearms, or skin cells under their fingernails. Crime scene investigators found no evidence of a struggle. Lamont's posture and the suddenness of the strike suggested he never saw the threat coming. This absence of conflict paints a vivid, terrifying visual of the final microseconds of his life, proving that his absolute trust in his geographical immunity persisted until the very last frame, because there was no warning, no shouted argument, and no physical altercation. Lamont never saw the threat coming. He likely looked toward the approaching vehicle, perhaps recognizing the faces inside, completely failing to register them as executioners until the muzzle flash illuminated the darkness. He died believing he was safe. The crime scene unit photographed the tarmac, collected the spent shell casings, and finally transported the body to the medical examiner's office. The physical mechanics of the assassination were complete. The streets had successfully audited the Finazzi ledger, and the debt had been paid in full. But as the detectives stood in the freezing wind, looking up at the towering brick facades of the surrounding tenement buildings, a new, far more insidious problem emerged. A barrage of 9 hollow point bullets, fired from a vehicle at 8:30 p.m. in a densely populated urban corridor, creates a massive acoustic and visual footprint. It is the auditory equivalent of setting off a bomb in a crowded theater. Dozens of apartment windows looked directly down onto that exact stretch of pavement. Pedestrians were walking on the adjacent avenues. People heard the engine. People saw the flashes, and people undoubtedly recognized the vehicle escaping the scene. Yet, as the detectives began to knock on doors and canvass the immediate perimeter, they were met with a phenomenon that would ultimately paralyze the American justice system. The physical execution of Big L was over, but the grotesque, suffocating machinery of the Harlem underworld was just beginning to operate. To comprehend the sheer scale of the investigative failure that immediately followed the murder of Lamont Coleman, we must first examine the acoustic and architectural reality of the crime scene. A barrage of 9 hollow-point bullets fired from a high-caliber weapon does not simply produce a localized noise. In the dense, concrete topography of Harlem, a gunshot operates as a concussive shockwave. It echoes violently off the brick facades of the tenements. It vibrates against the glass of the apartment windows, and it slices cleanly through the ambient hum of the urban winter. The intersection of 139th Street, D. Lenox Avenue is essentially an urban canyon. At 8:30 in the evening, this canyon is populated. Residents are watching television, looking out of their windows, walking their dogs, or returning from evening shifts. The visual and auditory footprint of a drive-by assassination in this specific geographical location is massive. Dozens, if not hundreds, of individuals heard the screech of the tires, witnessed the muzzle flashes illuminating the dark tarmac, and watched the tail lights of the getaway vehicle accelerate into the night. Yet, when the seasoned homicide detectives of the New York Police Department began their standard canvass of the neighborhood, they collided with a phenomenon that is both psychologically fascinating and judicially catastrophic. They walked up the dimly lit, narrow stairwells of the surrounding apartment buildings, knocking on heavy doors, presenting their badges, and asking the most basic investigative questions. Did you see a vehicle? Did you hear a dispute? Can you provide a physical description of the shooters? The response they received was not confusion, nor was it genuine ignorance. The response was a unified, impenetrable, and highly rehearsed amnesia. The physical manifestation of this silence was deafening. Detectives noted the sound of deadbolts clicking shut before they even reached the landings. Blinds were drawn tight. The civilians who were intercepted on the pavement suddenly developed a profound inability to recall their own whereabouts from just 20 minutes prior. The official police reports, which should have been overflowing with eyewitness accounts, vehicle descriptions, and directional trajectories, remained entirely blank. In a neighborhood of thousands, the NYPD could not find a single citizen willing to officially verify that a murder had even taken place in front of their own eyes. This brings us to the second axis of our evaluating rubric: how power is exercised in the danger zone. In civil society, power is exercised through the law, and civic duty compels citizens to report violent felonies. But the danger zone operates as a sovereign entity with its own unwritten constitution. And the highest, most uncompromising law of this land is the absolute prohibition of speaking to law enforcement. This is widely understood in modern popular culture as the stop snitching mandate. But to reduce this to a mere cultural catchphrase is a grave analytical error. It is not a trend. It is a rigid, unforgiving survival mechanism. The issue is not what the residents of Harlem refused to say to the detectives. The issue is how they internally justified their silence. We must look at the psychological terror that enforces this mandate. The civilians living on 139th Street performed a rapid, subconscious mathematical calculation the moment the police sirens arrived. They looked at the lifeless body of Big L, a wealthy, famous, beloved local icon with direct blood ties to Big Lee, one of the most feared enforcers in the borough. The logic of the streets dictated a terrifying conclusion. If the invisible syndicates operating in this postcode possess the audacity, the firepower, and the tactical precision to execute Lamont Coleman in broad daylight without hesitation, what would they do to a grandmother who provides a license plate number? What would they do to a bodega clerk who identifies a shooter in a police lineup? The silence of the neighborhood was not born of malice toward the victim. It was born of absolute, paralyzing, rational terror. The community understood that the NYPD would eventually pack up their crime scene tape, file their reports, and drive back to their fortified precincts. But the residents would have to remain on the block. They would have to walk the same corridors and stand on the same corners as the executioners. In an environment where witness protection is a myth and police presence is viewed as an occupying force rather than a protective shield, silence is the only universally accepted life insurance policy. To speak is to volunteer for the next chalk outline. This dynamic birthed a grotesque paradox. In the immediate days following the assassination, the exact same community that adamantly refused to cooperate with the homicide detectives began to publicly and aggressively mourn the victim. This is a psychological coping mechanism unique to heavily traumatized urban environments. They separate the tragedy of the death from the physical mechanics of the murder. Almost overnight, elaborate makeshift memorials erupted across the pavements of Harlem. Local graffiti artists, who likely knew the exact street names of the men in the getaway vehicle, painted massive, beautifully detailed murals of Big L on the brick walls of 139th Street. Hundreds of candles were lit. Empty liquor bottles were poured onto the concrete in a traditional gesture of respect. Cassette tapes of his complex, multisyllabic freestyles blasted from passing cars and apartment windows. The neighborhood collectively elevated Lamont Coleman to the status of a martyr, a brilliant poet violently stolen from them before his time. They wept for his mother. They wore commemorative T-shirts. Yet, when a detective holding a notepad approached these very same vigils, the crowd would instantly dissolve into silence, averting their eyes and walking away. They were entirely willing to canonize the victim, but they were absolutely unwilling to prosecute the killers. They offered Lamont Coleman their tears, their artwork, and their prayers, but they fundamentally refused to offer him justice. We must consider the excruciating psychological weight this placed upon the shoulders of Gilda Terry, Lamont's mother. She was forced to live inside this paradox because her son suffered from the fatal weakness of geographical loyalty. She was now permanently tethered to the geography of his murder. She had to walk out of her front door every morning and step over the exact patch of F concrete where her son had bled to death. She had to look into the eyes of the young men offering her condolences, fully aware that some of them possessed the exact information required to put her son's murderers in a penitentiary. She was trapped in a neighborhood that loved her son's music, but feared his executioners far more. The community essentially held her son's justice hostage to ensure their own survival. For the investigators of the NYPD, this wall of silence presented a near insurmountable forensic blockade. In the winter of 1999, the pervasive network of high-definition surveillance cameras that blankets modern cities did not exist. There was no CCTV footage capturing the license plate of the getaway vehicle. Because the shooters used a vehicle and fired from a distance, they left no DNA, no hair fibers, and no fingerprints on the victim's body. They did not drop the murder weapon in a nearby alley. The crime scene was a forensic void. Detectives rely on physical evidence to corroborate human intelligence. But when there is zero physical evidence, human intelligence is the only remaining currency. When that currency is completely withheld by a terrified populace, the wheels of the justice system immediately grind to a halt. The detectives were not dealing with a complex, locked room mystery. They were dealing with an open secret. In the deeply interconnected networks of the Harlem underworld, a high-profile hit of this magnitude cannot be kept quiet. The people involved talk. They boast. The word circulates through the prison system, through the local drug markets, and through the neighborhood barbershops. The police knew that the identity of the shooters was likely common knowledge among a specific demographic of 139th Street within 48 hours of the murder. The truth was suspended in the air, right in front of them, but it was heavily guarded by an ironclad cultural embargo. The investigation quickly transitioned from an active manhunt into a Jid-Saig ruling psychological waiting game. The detectives understood that they could not break the civilian wall of silence through standard interrogation or appeals to civic duty. The threat of underworld retaliation was infinitely more immediate and tangible than the threat of a police subpoena. To solve the execution of Big L, law enforcement had to completely abandon the civilian population. They had to wait for the criminal ecosystem to inevitably turn on itself. And this is where things really get dirty. In the mathematics of street power, alliances are never permanent. They are temporary treaties forged entirely out of mutual financial convenience. When pressure is applied, or when paranoia begins to set in, the criminal infrastructure rapidly fractures. The detectives knew that whoever orchestrated the proxy hit on Lamont Coleman would eventually make a mistake. They would betray an associate, they would be arrested on an unrelated narcotics charge, or they would become a target themselves. The wall of silence was impenetrable from the outside, but it was highly vulnerable to internal friction. The investigators simply had to wait for a fracture to appear. And months later, that fracture would finally reveal a name, bringing the narrative to its most devastating, intimately treacherous turning point. In May of 1999, 3 months after the execution, on 139th Street, the thick, impenetrable ice of the Harlem underworld finally began to fracture. The detectives of the New York Police Department did not experience a miraculous breakthrough. They did not locate the murder weapon submerged in a storm drain, nor did they recover a hidden security tape. And certainly, no civilian witness suddenly discovered the civic courage to walk into the precinct and testify. Instead, the break in the case came from the precise mechanism the seasoned investigators had been waiting for: the inevitable, cannibalistic friction of the street ecosystem. In the sovereign economy of the danger zone, secrets are highly volatile commodities. When a high-profile execution occurs, the architects of the hit inevitably discuss the logistics with their inner circle. Whispers circulate through the county jails. Informants trade fragments of intelligence for leniency on unrelated narcotics charges. and the invisible network of street politics begins to leak. Through this murky transactional pipeline of criminal intelligence, the homicide unit finally extracted a name. It was not the name of a faceless contract killer imported from out of state. It was a name deeply, intimately tethered to the very pavement where Lamont Coleman had been assassinated. The NYPD officially executed an arrest warrant for a 29-year-old Harlem resident named Gerard Woodley. When this name was leaked to the public, it produced a devastating revelation. Gerard Woodley was not a rival gang leader from a different borough. He was Lamont Coleman's childhood friend. They had grown up navigating the exact same treacherous grid of the danger zone. They had stood on the same corners, shared the same oxygen, and operated within the same tight-knit social circles. There are archival photographs of the two men standing shoulder to shoulder, posing for the camera with the relaxed familiarity that only exists between men who share a postcode and a history. This specific revelation completely recontextualizes the forensic reality of the crime scene. We must look back at the absence of defensive wounds on Lamont's hands. Previously, the medical examiner's report suggested that the attack was simply too fast for Lamont to react, but the introduction of Gerard Woodley into the timeline provides a far more insidious psychological explanation. If a vehicle pulls up to the curb and a masked stranger points a weapon, human instinct dictates panic. But what happens if the window rolls down and the face looking back at you is someone you have known since adolescence? You do not raise your hands in deafening. See, you drop your guard. You might even lean forward to greet them. The issue is not simply that Gerard Woodley allegedly pulled the trigger. The issue is that the killers explicitly weaponized a childhood bond to bypass Lamont's situational awareness. They used his comfort, his familiarity, and his geographical loyalty as the ultimate Trojan horse. Lamont died not just from ballistic trauma, but from a catastrophic betrayal of trust. The violent audit of this childhood friendship reveals how power was truly maintained in the underworld, pointing directly back to the ledger of Lamont's older brother, Leroy Big Lee Finney. By the spring of 1999, the NYPD had formulated a comprehensive, horrifyingly logical theory of the crime. According to law enforcement intelligence, Gerard Woodley was deeply embedded in the illicit street economy. More critically, Woodley and his faction had developed a severe, irreconcilable conflict with Big Lee. The exact genesis of this underworld dispute, whether it was a territorial infringement, a stolen narcotics shipment, or a perceived slight regarding street hierarchy, is a detail swallowed by the code of silence. But the mechanics of the fallout are brutally clear. In the hyper-violent corporate structure of the Harlem drug trade, you cannot allow a rival to disrespect your faction without delivering an immediate, disproportionate physical response. If you fail to retaliate, you project weakness. In the danger zone, projecting weakness is a terminal disease. It invites every other predator in the postcode to dismantle your operations. Woodley's reputation, his authority, and his financial survival required him to balance the ledger with Big Lee. But Big Lee was sitting inside a state penitentiary, heavily guarded by the New York Department of Corrections. He was physically untouchable. Woodley could not reach the primary antagonist. This is where the cold, emotionless arithmetic of the proxy hit was activated. We must look at the physical, manifestations of the psychological state of the predators. They observed their environment. They noted that Big Lee's younger brother, the famous rapper Big L, was walking around 139th Street without a bodyguard, draped in heavy gold jewelry, operating under the profound delusion of diplomatic immunity. Lamont was the softest, most highly visible, and most valuable asset connected to Big Lee's bloodline. Executing Lamont was a calculated masterstroke of street power. For the faction allegedly led by Woodley, it achieved a dual victory. First, it instantly restored their terrifying reputation on the pavement, proving they possessed the audacity to execute a high-profile celebrity in broad daylight. Second, and most importantly, it delivered a devastating psychological strike directly into Big Lee's prison cell. It was a message written in the absolute destruction of his family. You may be safe behind steel bars, but we own the streets, and we will eradicate your bloodline while you watch in complete impotence. When Gerard Woodley was brought into the interrogation room in May 1999, the seasoned homicide detectives believed they had finally cornered the architect of this atrocity. They sat across the steel table from a man who had allegedly looked his childhood friend in the eye before discharging 9 hollow-point bullets into his chest. The detectives possessed the motive. They possessed the street intelligence. They understood the complex geopolitical dynamics of the proxy war between Woodley and Big Lee. They had the narrative perfectly constructed, but the interrogation room is where the unforgiving reality of the American legal system brutally collides with the unwritten constitution of the streets. The detectives were prosecuting the behavior of the suspect, laying out the timeline, and attempting to force a confession. But Woodley did not panic. He did not break under the psychological pressure of the interrogation. He simply adopted the exact same tactic said by the residents of 139th Street. He deployed an absolute, impenetrable silence. The physical posture of a suspect in an interrogation room often reveals their understanding of their own legal leverage. Woodley understood the mechanics of a homicide indictment better than a first-year law student. He knew that the detectives across the table were bluffing. He knew that street intelligence, jailhouse whispers, and logical theories are completely worthless in a court of law without corroborating physical evidence. And this is where the grotesque reality of the investigation solidifies into a permanent legal paralysis. The NYPD had the prime suspect in custody, but their forensic ledger was completely bankrupt. The murder weapon, the physical mechanism of the execution, had vanished into the vast urban labyrinth of New York City. There was no DNA linking Woodley to the crime scene. There were no fingerprints on the shell casings. Most devastatingly, the civilian wall of silence held firm. Despite Woodley being physically removed from the street and placed in handcuffs, the residents of Harlem still refused to provide sworn testimonies. The psychological terror he and his faction had instilled in the danger zone was so profound that even his arrest could not convince a single eyewitness to step forward. The community looked at Woodley in custody and calculated that he would eventually be released. And when he returned to 139th Street, anyone whose name appeared on a police report would be hunted down and executed. The district attorney's office was forced to make a cold judicial calculation. In the American justice system, you do not prosecute a case based on what you know. You prosecute a case based entirely on what you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury. Presenting a case built solely on underworld rumor and the complex theory of proxy retaliation without a murder weapon or a single cooperating eyewitness is legal suicide. It guarantees an uitval. And once a suspect is acquitted by a jury, the principle of double jeopardy means they can never be tried for that exact crime again, even if a HD video of the murder surfaces the very next day. The prosecutors could not take that risk. They could not establish a viable indictment. The legal standoff reached its heartbreaking, inevitable conclusion. Due to a complete lack of physical evidence and the total failure of the civilian witness apparatus, the charges against Gerard Woodley were quietly dropped. He was processed out of the precinct. The heavy steel doors of the legal system opened, and the prime suspect in the assassination of one of the greatest lyricists in the history of music walked freely back onto the pavement of Harlem. The detectives were forced to watch him leave, knowing they were entirely powerless to stop him. The justice system had fundamentally failed. The investigation did not just go cold, it was placed into a state of permanent, deep freeze suspension. Woodley returned to the danger zone, his reputation now insulated by an almost mythical aura of invincibility. He had allegedly killed a king, stared down the full weight of the New York Police Department, and walked away without a scratch. For the family of Lamont Coleman, and for the global community that revered his intellect, this was the ultimate grotesque insult. The architect of their trauma was not hiding in a foreign country. He was walking the same avenues, breathing the same air, and operating within the exact same grid where the blood had been spilled. The legal system had completely abdicated its responsibility, surrendering the jurisdiction of 139th Street back to the predators. But while the courtrooms of Manhattan had closed the ledger on the Big L homicide, the sovereign economy of the streets never closes an account. In the underworld, an unpaid debt is a living, breathing entity, and the mechanism of street justice, while agonizingly slow, operates with an absolute, horrifying inevitability that Gerard Woodley was completely unprepared for. The American justice system operates on strict timelines, statutes of limitations, and the heavy machinery of bureaucracy. When a case file is closed due to a lack of physical evidence, it is placed in a cardboard box, relegated to a dusty archive, and legally forgotten. But the sovereign economy of the Harlem underworld does not operate on legal statutes. It operates on memory, leverage, and the absolute permanence of blood debt. The danger zone does not possess an eraser. For 17 years following the assassination of Lamont Coleman, Gerard Woodley continued to navigate the exact same geographical grid. He had successfully outmaneuvered the homicide detectives. He had walked out of the interrogation room, entirely insulated by the terrifying reputation he had violently curated. But in the mathematics of street power, a reputation built on extreme violence is not a permanent shield. It is a highly corrosive asset. When you introduce proxy assassination into the geopolitical ecosystem of a neighborhood, you establish a horrifying precedent. You teach the younger, hungrier factions that no one is untouchable, and that extreme violence is a completely legitimate mechanism for career advancement. As the years ground on, the power dynamics of 139th Street inevitably began to shift. The older generation of enforcers aged, their influence waned, and a new, hyper-aggressive generation took control of the pavement. The ironclad fear that Woodley had commanded in 1999 slowly began to evaporate. He was no longer the apex predator. He was simply an aging veteran in an environment that actively hunts the vulnerable. He was bound by the exact same psychological tether to the Harlem geography that had doomed his childhood friend. He had survived the most high-profile murder investigation in the borough's history, yet he refused to take his life and relocate. He stubbornly remained anchored to the very concrete where the ghosts of his past were buried. And so the relentless cannibalistic machinery of the street finally initiated its own unwritten judicial process. On the evening of Thursday, June 23, 2016, the cycle of violence arrived at its brutal, mathematically inevitable conclusion. Gerard Woodley, now 46 years old, was standing outside 106 West 139th Street, just a few dozen yards away from the exact location where Lamont Coleman had been killed 17 years prior. The physical mechanics of the event were almost identical. There was no argument. There was no performative intimidation. A shooter approached, raised a firearm, and executed a targeted strike. Woodley was shot directly in the head and chest. He collapsed and died on the familiar tarmac of the danger zone. When the NYPD arrived and secured the perimeter, they were met with the exact same phenomenon they had faced in 1999. The windows were shut. The pedestrians vanished. The community once again deployed an absolute, impenetrable wall of silence. No one saw the shooter. No one heard the motive. The streets simply audited the ledger, collected the outstanding debt, and firmly closed the account. The murder of Gerard Woodley remains unsolved, mirroring the exact forensic paralysis of his alleged victim. The moral decay at the core of this tragedy is defined by a systemic failure on every conceivable level. A generational intellect was eliminated merely to send a psychological message to a prison cell. An entire community watched a genius bleed to death and chose the cold comfort of silence over justice, actively shielding the executioners. The legal system proved utterly impotent, requiring a second street assassination 17 years later, just to balance the scales. The ecosystem functioned as a closed, lethal loop, eliminating its most talented son and protecting its most violent predator, only to eventually destroy him as well. Lamont Coleman cannot be viewed through the simplified lens of a Hollywood tragedy. His existence was defined by a brutal, unsparing reality. Lamont Coleman is the product of an environment where extreme economic deprivation forces brilliant minds to use language as a survival mechanism, and where bloodlines act as a permanent, inescapable gravity. He was a meticulous craftsman who engineered beauty out of the ugliest aspects of urban warfare, completely blind to the fact that the war did not respect his poetry. His legacy is a moral debt. It is a debt owed by an entertainment industry that eagerly extracts and monetizes the trauma of the streets, while offering absolutely no physical protection to the artists who provide the raw material. It is a debt owed by a society that prefers to consume the gritty aesthetic of street violence through headphones, completely divorced from the physical reality of the mothers who have to scrub the blood off the pavement. If it weren't for his profound, naive geographical loyalty, if he had simply taken his advance money, hired security, and physically severed his ties to 139th Street the moment his brother was incarcerated, history might have crowned him the undisputed global king of contemporary lyricism. He possessed the intellect to rewrite the entire architectural framework of modern music, Instead, he serves as a permanent, haunting forensic reminder. In the danger zone, words can make you immortal, but only silence keeps you alive.